Good evening, this is Goldie, also known as Mr. Anecdotal, Mr. Pasty, and the Talking Head. It's Wednesday, February 23rd, 2011, and I'm in a gated, secure location. Remember, most importantly, I rant so you don't have to. By the way, if I do not have your email and you would like to receive the script of each show, send me your email to my new email address, goldyrant@gmail.com. Dementia, and its more specific Alzheimer's, several very rude diseases. Not so rude or painful to the afflicted, but very rude and painful to the caregivers, the family, and the friends. As our life expectancy has increased, so have the incidences of these degenerative brain diseases. We used to die of other things that have been cured, and so now we have to deal with these crappy end-of-life ailments, and believe me, they are crappy. I think what most people need to remember is the person as they were when they were coherent, not at this stage of irrational rage and antagonism. This is a very hard thing to do. Here's a brief summary of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about homeschooling and intelligence. I'm going to talk about healthcare. I'm going to talk about the difference between private sector and public sector unions in relation to the current Wisconsin governor's attempt to eliminate the collective bargaining right of Wisconsin's public sector unions. I was out with someone, a girl, a few months ago, and we were discussing what I do in these rants. And I talked about how I try to use the intelligence that I have and the things that I have learned to analyze the stream. Against my own self-interest, I said I was an elitist. I grew up in the Northeast, I did well in school, I went to a great university, and I went to a great law school. I thought I was intelligent and proud of it. Not egotistical, but a proud elitist. She said, "Don't say that you're an elitist." Obviously, I agreed with her then, but now I don't care. Let me show you where being afraid of intelligence and not proud of intelligence gets you. There was an op-ed written by Leonard Pitts Jr. on February 4th, 2011, entitled "Evolving Backward," and it was in the Austin American-Statesman. Here it is. Item: only 28% of high school science teachers consistently follow National Research Council guidelines encouraging them to present students with evidence of evolution. 28%. 13% explicitly advocate creationism or intelligent design. These are among the findings of Penn State political scientists Michael Berkman and Eric Plutzer after examining data from a representative survey of 926 high school biology teachers. Writing in the January 28th issue of Science magazine, they report that most science teachers, 60%, cheat controversy by such stratagems as telling students it does not matter if they believe in evolution so long as they understand enough to pass a test. Or they teach evolution on a par with creationism and encourage students to make up their own minds. Here's a story that he made up, Mr. Pitts. Once upon a time there lived a stupid giant. The giant had not always been stupid, or perhaps it is more accurate to say the giant had once revered intelligence, reason, and the byproducts thereof. Indeed, the giant was renowned for an ingenuity and standard of living that made it the envy of the world. But much of the world did more than envy the giant. Much of the world admired and respected it. Its basic decency, along with its strength and intelligence, set it apart. There came a time, however, when, though the giant retained its strength and arguably even its decency, it lost its intelligence. No one can say exactly how and when the loss occurred. There was no great blast of thunder and lightning to herald it, no sudden instant when the giant's intelligence plummeted dramatically from the instant before. No. Stupidity crept over the giant with the stealth of twilight, a product less of one abrupt moment than of 1,000 moments of complacency, of resting on laurels, of allowing curiosity to be teased and bullied out of bright children, of dumbing down textbooks so kids could get better grades with less work, of using elite like a curse word, and of behaving as if knowing things and being able to extrapolate from and otherwise make critical use of the things one knows was a betrayal of some fundamental human authenticity. Some need to keep it real. Stupidity stole over the giant until it could no longer tell science from faith, or conventional wisdom from actual wisdom, and in any event, valued ideological purity above them all. Stupidity snaked over the giant until science teachers shrank from teaching science. History books contained history that wasn't history. Late-night comics got easy laughs from people on the street who could not say when the War of 1812 was fought. Political leaders told outright lies with blithe smiles and no fear of being caught. And you would not have been surprised to hear that someone had fixed mathematics so that 2 plus 2 could now equal 17, thus preserving the all-important self-esteem of second-grade kids. Some regarded the giant stupidity as a danger. They reasoned that when one is so big that one's merest movement or slightest utterance affects the entire world, it's a good idea if those movements and utterances are animated by something more than autonomic function. Others saw the giant's stupidity as an opportunity. They learned eagerly until they surpassed the giant's intellect. They grew until they rivaled the giant's size and strength. They did not attempt to match the giant's decency. They considered decency a hindrance. And the giant, it sat on its haunches in the mud as the world changed about it and new giants rose and shook their fists. The giant did not notice. It was watching the Jersey Shore on MTV, and it lived obliviously ever after. I'll tell you when that started. It started in 1980, because I could not believe that Ronald Reagan won that election. All right. So I ran across some family members that, as it turns out, are homeschooling their kids. These are the first people who I've run across that are doing homeschooling, surprisingly. You can imagine my skepticism. Since we all have our prejudices, I was thinking that I was going to hear proselytizing and Bible thumping. Nothing could be further from the truth. This particular example is quite obviously specialized for several reasons. The first reason is that the mother, who I will call Coconut or Coco, is absolutely involved in the homeschooling process. The second reason is that the kids, 16 and 12 years old, are very intelligent. The third reason is that the kids, let's call them Nazaboy and Mikey, are self-starters and are both competitive golfers. They have learned to make friends over a wide variety of groups and cliques. I asked, what about the prom? I thought back to my own prom, which was a great party, and I also thought about those people that did not go to my prom. At the time, I assumed most of those people that did not go were depressed, and I have to ask, how did they turn out? I actually don't know. The response from Coconut is that Nazaboy does not need to go. He has friends, he meets girls from a variety of high schools, and he may be asked by one of these girls to go to a prom. And he might go, or he might not. I commented that it may be more important in this day and age for people to be able to make friends easily versus the old-timey way of having lifelong friends from high school. It also goes along with my economic theory that we want our entire workforce to be flexible enough to be able to move at the drop of a hat to wherever the jobs are. In any event, Nazaboy is taking some AP classes in the homeschooling, which are very difficult and push him to the limit. Last year, he went to the public high school and took AP classes that were not as strong and did not push him as much. By the way, I took a lot of AP classes. This fits right in with my theory of abolishing public education as well. Coco is not just making a lunch for her kids, putting them on the bus in the morning and then listening to them lie about whether they did their homework that day. She is deeply involved in both their school and social lives. Personal responsibility, and I love it. Additionally, we were all able to go and assist in a family crisis with no limitation or requirement of attending school, as they are attending school via the internet. I'm handling what little work I have via the internet as well. I'm not saying that homeschooling will work for everyone. It won't. But it will work if one of the parents can stay at home with the children and be the teacher's assistant or slave driver, which Coco is. I believe that Nazaboy, in 10th grade, is mature enough to handle some of these rants and use them to gain a tiny bit of perspective, as well as skepticism of everything that he hears and reads. Okay, so a few days ago I was invited by the delicate genius to have a drink with her and a few friends who she had told of my propensity to rant. I did not disappoint. I tried to explain that I don't argue, I go deep. I gave an example or two, and the female friend, let's call her Foxy, who watches Fox for real, and I mean for real. And she blurted out that Obama doesn't know a damn thing about healthcare. I smiled and paused, and then I made a decision. It's the decision I usually make. I went in. You may remember from my past healthcare rants that we have several unanswered questions as well as several assumptions that have pretty much been proven to be true. The unanswered question is, what type of healthcare do we want in this country? The assumptions are that if you have never had a pre-existing condition and been denied coverage, if you have not reached the limit of your policy, if you have not lost your job and been unable to, as an unemployed person, find insurance coverage, then you will not like Obamacare, even though you don't know what is contained in that bill. And you will not want anything to affect your current plan. If any of those things have happened to you, or a family member or a friend, then you like Obamacare, even though you don't know what is contained in that bill. It took about 15 minutes for those concepts to sink in, and then I had to leave. But I feel like I got her thinking, which I consider success. We weren't even able to get to some of the discussions related to my first axiom, and that is that most people agree that they would be happy to pay a few pennies in taxes so that every single person in America that wants one could get a flu shot. Well, actually, every single citizen is the agreement that I've gotten from 95% of the people who I've spoken to about that theory. So we mostly agree that some type of universal health care in the form of a flu shot is workable. It obviously breaks down when we start talking about transplants, as well as the amount that each person should contribute to this universal health care, as well as how much privacy we would be willing to give up to get a discount on our public premiums. There was an op-ed in the New York Times dated February 20th, 2011 by Donna Dubinsky, and she's just a layman, entitled "Money Won't Buy You Health Insurance." This op-ed relates to the current state of the existing system. Here it is. This isn't the story of a poor family with a mother who has a dreadful disease that bankrupts them, or with a child who has to go without vital medicines. Unlike many others, my family can afford medical care, with or without insurance. Most employees assume that if they lose their job and the health coverage that comes along with it, they'll be able to purchase insurance somewhere. I've assumed that, by the way. The members of Congress who want to repeal the provision of last year's health insurance law that makes it easier for individuals to buy coverage must assume that uninsured people do not want to buy it, or just too cheap or too poor to do so. The truth is that individual health insurance is not easy to get. She's right. And this is her speaking again. I found this out the hard way. 6 years ago, my company was acquired. Since my husband had retired a few years earlier, we found ourselves without an employer and thus without health insurance. Why did we even need insurance? First, we wanted to know that if we had a medical catastrophe, we would not exhaust our savings. Second, uninsured patients are billed more than the rates that insurers negotiate with doctors and hospitals, and we wanted to pay those lower rates. The difference is significant. My recent MRI cost $1,300 at the retail rate, while the rate negotiated by the insurance company was $700. An insurance broker helped me sort through the options. I settled on a high deductible plan and filled out the long application. I diligently listed the various minor complaints for which we had been seen over the years, knowing that these might turn up later and be a basis for revoking coverage if they were not disclosed. That's absolutely critical, by the way. If you saw Sicko, you would know it. Then the first letter arrived, denied. It never occurred to me that we would be denied. Yes, we had listed a bunch of minor ailments, but nothing serious. No cancer, no chronic diseases like asthma or diabetes, no hospital stays. Why were we denied? What were these pre-existing conditions that put us into high-risk categories? For me, it was a corn on my toe, for which my podiatrist had recommended an in-office procedure. My daughter was denied because she takes regular medication for a common teenage issue. My husband was denied because his ophthalmologist had identified a slow-growing cataract. Basically, if there's any possible procedure in your future, insurers will deny you. The broker then proposed that the three of us make individual applications. Perhaps one or two of us might be accepted rather than the family as a group. As I filled out more applications, I discovered a critical error in my strategy. The first question was, have you ever been denied health insurance? Now my answer was yes, giving the new companies reason to be wary of my application. I learned too late that the best tactic is to apply simultaneously to as many companies as possible so that you don't have to admit to a denial. I completed 4 applications for each of the 3 of us, using reams of paper. I learned to read the questions carefully. I mulled over the difference between a condition and something for which you have sought treatment. I was precise and succinct. I felt as if I was doing a deposition. Give the minimum true information and not a word more. I was accepted by exactly one insurance company, so was my daughter, although at a 50% premium over the standard charge for a girl her age. My husband was also accepted by one insurer, but was denied by the company that approved me. Our premiums, which were reasonable at first, have increased substantially over the last 6 years. The average annual increase has been 20%. I now am paying premiums that are more than double what they were initially. This is 6 years. And because these are high deductible policies, we still are paying most of the medical bills ourselves. The new healthcare reform legislation is not perfect. Nothing that complex could be. But I have no doubt that the system is broken and reform is absolutely essential. If we are not going to have universal coverage but are going to rely on employer plans, then we must offer individuals, self-employed people, and small businesses a place to purchase insurance at a reasonable price. If members of Congress feel so strongly about undoing this important legislation, perhaps we should stop providing them with health insurance. Let's credit their pay for the amount that has been paid by the taxpayers, and let them try to buy health insurance in the individual market. My bet is that they would all be denied. I agree. Health insurance reform might suddenly not seem to them like such a bad idea. This op-ed not only proves my main point of the distinction between the two types of people that like or don't like Obamacare, neither type of which has read the bill, but it also shows the brokenness of the system. If you're willing to keep this broken system and have people, including yourself, bankrupted or worse, dead, because you don't have coverage. When I brought this up to Foxy, she said that I needed to join a law firm so that I would have to be accepted into the plan. That's like with big corporations. They don't have pre-existing conditions because they negotiate that. I started getting a little angry and retorted that aren't small businesses, as the Republicans argued during the debate over the extension of the Bush tax cuts, the main creators of 80% of all jobs in this country? This kind of shut her up, and it was obvious that, like many other actual Fox watchers and MSNBC and Jon Stewart watchers, that she had not really thought about the issues. Even though my nickname is Mr. Anecdotal, here's some factual stuff that I read in the Rice Magazine number 8 in 2010. It's an article by Jessica Stark entitled Better Healthcare, Lower Cost. An interview with Vivian Ho, healthcare economist at Rice University, is very, very informative. She actually looks at facts, and let me give you some quotes. Ho and her team have looked at hospitals in Texas and found that they receive reasonable government subsidies to care for the uninsured, so that cost doesn't appear to be shifted to a privately insured patient. Rather, the costs of treating privately insured patients seem to be rising on their own. Costs continue to rise because doctors and hospitals are rewarded for performing more services, not for improving patient health, Ho said. Our system is set up to reward specialists performing costly surgeries, not general practitioners taking preventative measures. Studies have shown that Medicare, Medicaid, and the private sector richly reward specialists for performing aggressive and costly surgeries on patients who've suffered a heart attack or are at risk for heart disease, whereas general practitioners would actually lose money if they spent the amount of time necessary to advise and treat the patients to prevent them from developing the disease. She said that during the last 15 years, Americans have spent twice as much on technologies to ease lower back pain. However, there has been no documented improvement in outcomes associated with these treatments. Think about that for a second before you spew that you want the current bankrupting of society's system to continue. It cannot continue. Moving on. I've spoken about the concept of alignment in terms of those times of agreement. The context that I used was my call to action regarding Governor Rick Perry's designation of more stringent standards for the use of eminent domain in the state of Texas. Remember, he's running for president. My main point was that I'm able to use the people that I dislike or that actually disgust me to get the things done that I need done, overlooking my points of disagreement with such person of disgust, or POG. Originally, prior to the 2010 election, I discussed with my Tea Party friend the origins and funding for the Tea Party. He responded, "So what?" I agreed. So what? He convinced me. Looking at the Tea Partiers in Congress failing to defeat, Looking at the Tea Parties in Congress failing to defeat the most fundamental of constitutional civil liberties, the non-extension of certain provisions of the Patriot Act should elicit the same response for our purposes. So what? We must look for these points of alignment and take advantage of them when they happen. Additionally, the idea of the Koch brothers being the primary initial funders of the Tea Party, whatever the Tea Party might be, is them using the same theory of alignment to fund this group of Tea Partiers and various candidates, including the Wisconsin governor, so that they can use the times of alignment to forward their interests. I say this without commenting on the fairness of our system, which allows large donors disproportionate influence over our politicians. For discussions of that fairness, I will leave those to Paul Krugman later on. All right, here's the article. Koch brothers behind Wisconsin effort to kill public unions by Rick Unger, dated February 18, 2011. As the nation focuses on the efforts of Governor Scott Walker to take away collective bargaining rights from public employees in Wisconsin, new information is coming to light that reveals what is truly going on here. Mother Jones is reporting that much of the funding behind the Walker for Governor campaign came from none other than the uber-conservatives, the infamous Koch brothers. What's more, the plan to kill the unions is right out of the Koch brothers' playbook. Koch-backed groups like Americans for Prosperity, the Cato Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and the Reason Foundation have long taken a very antagonistic view toward public sector unions. Several of these groups have urged the eradication of these unions. The Kochs also invited Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, an anti-union outfit, to a June 2010 confab in Aspen, Colorado, which, by the way, I talked about last week, via Mother Jones. If you are reluctant to believe that this is a coordinated attack, consider this. This afternoon, Marty Beal, executive director for the Wisconsin Public Workers Union, sent a message to the governor's office agreeing to the cuts to pension and welfare benefits sought by Walker in his bill. He said, "I agree." The governor's response was nothing doing. He wants the whole kit and caboodle, the end of the collective bargaining rights of the public unions. As noted in my earlier post, this is indeed the first shot in the final battle to end unionism in America. The Americans for Prosperity group, a Tea Party group that is a Koch brothers front, has put up a website and petition called www.standwithwalker.com. The website attacks all collective bargaining, not just for public employees' unions. Americans for Prosperity is also organizing a rally tomorrow in Wisconsin to support Governor Walker. Why are the Koch brothers so interested in Wisconsin? Well, they are a major business player in the state. This from Think Progress. Koch owns a coal company subsidiary with facilities in Green Bay, Manitowoc, Ashland, and Sheboygan, 6 timber plants throughout the state, and a large network of pipelines in Wisconsin. While Koch controls much of the infrastructure in the state, they have laid off workers to boost profits. You smelling the message. At a time when Koch Industries owners David and Charles Koch awarded themselves an extra $11 billion of income from the company, Koch slashed jobs at their Green Bay plant. Okay. Officials at Georgia Pacific said the company is laying off 158 workers at its Day Street plant because out-of-date equipment at the facility is being replaced with newer, more efficient equipment. The company said much of the new paper-making equipment will be automated. Malik tells Fox 11 that the layoffs are not because of a drop in demand. In fact, Malik said demand is high for the bath tissue and napkins manufactured at the plant. You really have to wonder how long it will take for Tea Party devotees to realize just how badly they are being used. That last line sounds like I wrote it. I will reiterate a position that I've taken over and over again. No one is entitled to the status quo. In the case of people who take jobs in the public sector, that status quo was, at least when I looked at working for the state of Texas as a lawyer, that you would get paid less than the private sector, but that you got health care and a pension. So as to the Wisconsin thing, since we don't know whether the state is attempting to breach a contract or renegotiate an existing one, we have to talk about each circumstance. In contract law, we learned that there is no moral obligation to keeping to your contracts, and that each contract has remedies if a party breaches it. The non-defaulting party is going to be angry, but they will have remedies either specifically in the contract or in the law of that particular state if the contract is silent. In the case of the union contract, I'm happy to see peaceful protests by tens of thousands of people. However, The state has the right to both renegotiate the contract if it is expiring or breach the contract and pay the damages if they are breaching. I understand that people took lower salaries because of these other benefits, in the same way that I took a higher salary at a law firm knowing that I did not get any of these benefits. When I went off on my own, out of the firm, my attitude towards the status quo got much more violent. When I got out of the firm on my own, my attitude towards the status quo got much more violently that I eat what I kill. There was no status quo. I was always staring at the abyss. Most people that have steady employment always assume the status quo will remain. Always. Most people that work for themselves never assume the status quo. They're scared shirtless. In an op-ed in the New York Times on February 22, 2011, Bob Herbert is reproducing some letters from Bernie Sanders, Vermont senator, that he received from constituents. Here's one of those letters. All we want to do is work hard and pay our bills. We're just not sure even that part of the American dream is still possible anymore. One of the things I noticed reading through the letters was the pervasive sense of loss, not just of employment, but of faith in the soundness and possibilities of America. For centuries, Americans have been nothing if not optimistic. But now there is a terrible sense that so much that was taken for granted during the past 6 or 7 decades is being dismantled or destroyed. You hear his messages. A 26-year-old man who emerged from college with big dreams wrote, I had hoped to be able to support not just myself by this point, but to be able to think about settling down and starting a family. My family always told me that an education was the ticket to success, but all my education seems to have done in this landscape is make it impossible to pull myself out of debt and begin a successful career. Two differing views on the Wisconsin union busting tactics appeared in the New York Times in recent days. This is me speaking, I've spoken in the past about how unions in the public and private sector are very different, and the structures of each are on opposite ends of the spectrum as to the incentives and disincentives of each. In private sector unions, the unions bargain against owners of companies. In public sector unions, unions bargain against elected officials who do not use their own money to pay the salaries and benefits of the union members. So they use our money. Additionally, the unions, under the Citizens United case, are able to deliver political donations to the very people that they are negotiating against, as well as the promise of the delivery of votes in the next election. They are two very different animals. David Brooks' view appears in an op-ed in the New York Times on February 22, 2011, entitled Make Everybody Hurt. Over the past few weeks, we've begun to see the new contours of American politics. The budget cutters have taken control of the agenda, while government's defenders are waging tactical retreats. Given the scope of the fiscal problems, it could be like this for the next 10 or 20 years. No place is hotter than Wisconsin. The leaders there have done everything possible to maximize conflict. Governor Scott Walker, a Republican, demanded cuts only from people in the other party. Let me repeat that. Governor Scott Walker, a Republican, demanded cuts only from people in the other party. That's not illegal. The public sector unions and their allies immediately flew into a rage, comparing Walker to Hitler, Mussolini, and Mubarak. Walker's critics are amusingly Orwellian. They liken the crowd in Madison to the ones in Tunisia and claim to be fighting for democracy. Whatever you might say about Walker, he and the Republican majorities in Wisconsin were elected, and they are doing exactly what they told voters they would do. It's the Democratic minority that is thwarting the majority will by fleeing to Illinois. It's the left that has suddenly embraced extra-legal obstructionism. By the way, Brooks' use of the word extra-legal is his lame way of not saying illegal, since it is not illegal for a group of minority party legislators to flee a state in order to prevent a quorum. It's been done several times in Texas. Back to the article. Still, let's try to put aside the hyperventilation. Everybody now seems to agree that Governor Walker was right to ask state workers to pay more for their benefits. Even if he gets everything he asked for, Wisconsin state workers would still be contributing less to their benefits than the average state worker nationwide, and would be contributing far, far less than private sector workers. The more difficult question is whether Walker was right to try to water down Wisconsin's collective bargaining agreements. Even if you acknowledge the importance of unions in representing middle-class interests, there are strong arguments on Walker's side. In Wisconsin and elsewhere, state-union relations are structurally out of whack. That's because public sector unions and private sector unions are very different creatures. This is Brooks talking. Private sector unions push against the interests of shareholders and management. Public sector unions push against the interests of taxpayers. Private sector union members know that their employers could go out of business, so they have an incentive to mitigate their demands. Public sector union members work for state monopolies and have no such interest. Private sector unions confront managers who have an incentive to push back against their demands. Public sector unions face managers who have an incentive to give in to them for the sake of their own survival. Most important, public sector unions help choose those they negotiate with. Through gigantic campaign contributions and overall clout, they have enormous influence over who gets elected to bargain with them, especially in state and local races. As a result of these imbalanced incentive structures, states with public sector unions tend to run into fiscal crises. Do you smell his message? They tend to have workplaces where personnel decisions are made on the basis of seniority, not merit. There's little relationship between excellence and reward, which leads to resentment among taxpayers who don't have that luxury. Now, he is spewing the myth of the problem with teachers. Back to the thing. Yet I think Governor Walker has made a strategic error in setting up this confrontation, as he did. The debt problems before us are huge. Even in Wisconsin, they cannot be addressed simply by taking on public sector unions. Studies done in North Carolina and elsewhere suggest that collective bargaining only increases state worker salaries by about 5 or 6%. That's not nearly enough to explain current deficits. There are many states without collective bargaining that still face gigantic debt crisis. Think Texas, there's no unions there at all. Getting state and federal budgets under control will take decades. It will require varied, multi-pronged approaches, supported by broad and shifting coalitions. It's really important that we establish an unwritten austerity constitution, a set of practices that will help us cut effectively now and in the future. The foundation of this unwritten constitution has to be this principle: make everybody hurt. The cuts have to be spread more or less equitably among as many groups as possible. There will never be public acceptance if large sectors of society are excluded. Governor Walker's program fails that test. It spares traditional Republican groups, even cops and firefighters. It is thus as unsustainable as the current tide of red ink. Moreover, the Constitution must emphasize transparent evaluation. Over the past weeks, Governor Walker increased expenditures to pump up small business job creation and cut them on teacher benefits. That might be the right choice, but if voters are going to go along with the choices such as these, there's going to have to be a credible evaluation process to explain why some things are cut and some things aren't. So I'd invite Governor Walker and the debt fighters everywhere to think of themselves as founding fathers of austerity. They are not only balancing budgets, they are setting precedent for a process that will last decades. By their example, they have to create habits that diverse majorities can respect and embrace. The process has to be balanced. This has to make everybody hurt. Now, the thing, obviously, that bothers me about this particular editorial op-ed is that it does not talk about tax cuts for the wealthy as one of the other methods of making everybody hurt. As I've said in the past, none of my clients would stop doing deals because they might pay 30% versus 20% on capital gains taxes. None. In fact, they were doing deals when it was 30%. All they did was pocket the bonus. They didn't do any more deals when it went from 30 to 20. All right, Paul Krugman's fairness view appeared in an op-ed in the New York Times on February 21st, 2011. Here it is. Last week, in the face of protest demonstrations against Wisconsin new union-busting Governor Scott Walker, demonstrations that continued through the weekend, with huge crowds on Saturday, Representative Paul Ryan made an unintentionally apt comparison. It's like Cairo has moved to Madison. It wasn't the smartest thing for Mr. Ryan to say. And by the way, it wasn't the first not smartest thing that Mr. Ryan has said, since he probably didn't mean to compare Mr. Walker, a fellow Republican, to Hosni Mubarak. Or maybe he did. After all, quite a few prominent conservatives, including Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, and Rick Santorum, denounced the uprising in Egypt. Let me say that. After all, quite a few prominent conservatives, now Krugman uses the word conservatives, I prefer using the word that I would like to use. Quite a few prominent Republicans, including Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, and Rick Santorum, denounce the uprising in Egypt and insist that President Obama should have helped the Mubarak regime suppress it. Oh, God. In any case, however, Mr. Ryan was more right than he knew. For what's happening in Wisconsin isn't about the state budget, despite Mr. Walker's pretense that he's just trying to be fiscally responsible. It is instead about power. What Mr. Walker and his backers are trying to do is make Wisconsin, and eventually America, less of a functioning democracy and more of a third world style oligarchy. And that's why anyone who believes that we need some counterweight to the political power of big money should be on the demonstrators' side. Fairness. Back to the op-ed. Some background. Wisconsin is indeed facing a budget crunch, although its difficulties are less severe than those facing many other states. Revenue has fallen in the face of a weak economy, while stimulus funds, which helped close the gap in 2009 and 2010, have faded away. In this situation, it makes sense to call for shared sacrifice, including monetary concessions from state workers. And union leaders have signaled that they are, in fact, willing to make such concessions. But Mr. Walker isn't interested in making a deal. Partly that's because he doesn't want to share the sacrifice. Even as he proclaims that Wisconsin faces a terrible fiscal crisis, he's been pushing through tax cuts that make the deficit worse. I think I just said that. Mainly, however, he's made it clear that rather than bargaining with workers, he wants to end workers' ability to bargain. The bill that has inspired the demonstrations would strip away collective bargaining rights from many of the state's workers, in effect busting public employee unions. Tellingly, some workers, namely those who tend to be Republican-leaning, are exempted from the ban. It's as if Mr. Walker were flaunting the political nature of his actions. Why bust the unions? As I said, it has nothing to do with helping Wisconsin deal with its current fiscal crisis, nor is it likely to help the state's budget prospects, even in the long run. Contrary to what you may have heard, public sector workers in Wisconsin and elsewhere are paid somewhat less than private sector workers with comparable qualifications. So there's not much room for further pay squeezes. So it's not about the budget, it's about the power. In principle, every American citizen has an equal say in our political process. In principle, every American citizen has an equal say in our political process. In practice, of course, some of us are more equal than others. Billionaires can field armies of lobbyists. They can finance think tanks that put the desired spin on policy issues. They can funnel cash to politicians with sympathetic views, as the Koch brothers did in the case of Mr. Walker. On paper, we're a one-person, one-vote nation. In reality, we're more than a bit of an oligarchy, in which a handful of wealthy people dominate. Goldy's view exactly. Given this reality, it's important to have institutions that can act as counterweights to the power of big money, and unions are among the most important of these institutions. You don't have to love unions, you don't have to believe that their policy positions are always right, to recognize that they're among the few influential players in our political system representing the interests of middle and working class Americans, as opposed to the wealthy. Indeed, if America has become more oligarchic and less democratic over the last 30 years, which it has, that's to an important extent due to the decline of private sector unions. Interesting, interesting, interesting. I can remember my discussion of the distinction between public and private sector unions and the structural regulatory differences between the two. One of the things that exactly the same is the structural regulatory defect created by the Citizens United case that allows all unions, both private and public, as well as corporations and, frankly, any group of more than one person to give unlimited sums to political campaigns, as is their Supreme Court incorrectly determined free speech right. However, let's get back to that certain issue that I don't like dealing with, which is fairness. I try and be pure in my discussions, much like Judge Napolitano, purity of essence. I had a friend of mine, a keyboard player, say that this is a waste of my time, this rant, because I'm not going to change anything. Let's assume that what he says is true. We will never get anyone to change anything. We will never fix a structural regulatory defect. We will never fix the structural regulatory defect that allows disproportionate power to reside in corporations, unions, and rich people. In that case, we should not have extended the tax cuts for the rich. So this is an interesting, think about it. If you think about fairness, And if we're not going to be able to pass any constitutional amendments to limit the powers of these big people, these big groups, we should not have extended the tax cuts for the rich. We should help unions, which are mainly comprised of middle-income workers. And we should offer universal health care. This position I will call the Krugman position. Tell me where I'm wrong, assuming we can never effect structural change. So if we assume that my buddy is correct, that my rants are stupid, they're not going to work, none of you are going to be able to help me effect any change, we're going to continue to have corporations, unions, and other groups with disproportionate power, then Krugman's right. For fairness, we need to not allow tax cuts for the rich. We need to redistribute income because that income was earned due to the disproportionate power. I received an email for the Tea Party group FreedomWorks, which I will not read, but will include in next week's email. It should disgust you if you believe in fairness. If you don't, it will disgust you because you will believe what the email says is true. And I can't wait till you read it. It's signed by Dick Armey, FreedomWorks. I'm a member. That's all there is today. I want to thank our sponsors, all of which support this form of conversation, but not necessarily the content of this conversation. PianoByAngelo.com, Angelo Limbesi's. ZetaDesign.com for all of your decorative painting needs. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your Austin plumbing problems. www.ticoadventurelodge.com, a small hotel in Samara, Costa Rica. CNC Surf School in Samara at www.cncsurfsamara.webs.com. La Vela Latina, great sunset bar and restaurant in Samara. Ambar Tequila at www.santospirits.com, an extremely smooth tequila. Another cool little hotel in Samara at www.villablancasamara.com. And of course, the Delicate Genius in Houston, who is a platinum sponsor. And we will be having a Fed rant soon. Thanks for coming out.